Hello, everyone. Happy Friday and happy Data Protection Week or Data Privacy Week, depending on where you are and how you're looking at things. I'm very happy to be this week in Brussels, actually, where our community got to celebrate again CPDP in a special day during Data Protection Week in Brussels. But I am even happier to be joining our LinkedIn community today together with Dan Nechita, who is head of cabinet of MEP Dragos Tudorache, and who has been one of the busiest guys on the planet in the past year, working on one of the very, very important legislative texts, perhaps of this decade, the EU AI Act. Hello, Dan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Gabriela, and thank you so much for having me. And I gotta say, busiest on the planet, it's a little too much. It was a busy period, but still within normal limits.
I have to say that when the community was following those marathon negotiations on the trilogue, the last bit of it, I think that's when we got a bit of a sense that, oh my goodness, the people in that room must be very, very dedicated. How did that all feel? How did you go through the marathon?
I think that was an amazing experience. I think that when we walked in, I think we had a fairly good idea or a good feel that we will be getting to a deal on the file, but it's just a monster of a file. So many details, so many things that are linked with one another, and the negotiation process was expected to take long. In a sense, once we passed the 17-hour mark, and that was the longest one we've known of a trialogue, we said, okay, now we're really breaking records here. Didn't expect to last as much as it did. And I think it took 37 hours on the clock, or 37 hours, with a little break. So we had a break in between. But it was really good, I think. And it was good that we took our time, because we got to discuss all of the issues that could have been left open for later on, and which could have made us stumble or dragged on the process. So we came out of it with a fairly good political deal on the file. And for those who are not familiar with the process, in 10 seconds, it's basically these negotiations happen between the three main institutions of the European Union, namely the Commission, the Council representing the member states, and the Parliament. That's why it's a difficult process, because you have many actors involved in that.
And there were so many headlines after the trialogue, that last marathon trialogue, that we have an EU AI Act now. And then I remember how everyone was looking everywhere for a text to see what is in it. And it was a very difficult task, because there was no text. And this is why our conversation this week comes at the perfect time, because this week is where, let's say, I know it's one of those European things, but we have like a draft final text, right?
Exactly.
And we could actually see the language that was agreed on at a political level. So it's quite significant to have a look at that. Before we go a bit into the details, can you tell us where we are now in the process? So it's a draft final text. Are there any more negotiations? What are the next steps?
No, I think that, to keep this short, because it's very technical, it's a draft final text, because it just needs to be proofread. We need to align some of the numbering of the articles and so on, that it needs to go through a language check, and so on. So the final text, which will be published in the Journal of the European Union, will come in a month or so. after there is formal adoption in Parliament and Council. But look, if you're looking at the text to understand what you need to do as a company or as an officer enforcing it, then that's what you need to do, what's in the text. Of course, it's harder to read if you know, your references between articles are not perfectly aligned, but yeah.
Absolutely. We can already guide a bit relying on this text. How would you describe the high-risk AI systems and how they ended up in Annex 3? I know a lot of the folks following us are already familiar with some of the high-risk AI systems and how they are defined. Can you walk us a bit through at least a couple of examples of what we have in Annex 3 and whether they have been enhanced in this last stages of the negotiations?
Yeah, definitely. So I will start with the assumption that we know how the AI Act works. That is, if you're in the annex of high-risk use cases of AI, then you need to do a conformity assessment in order to be compliant with the regulation. And the conformity assessment is outlined in the regulation. So with that, then you have the work that we have done on maintaining an equilibrium or a balance or trying to achieve two objectives that are complementary but sometimes at tension is one is to not overburden the market with excessive regulation where you don't need to, and the second one to make sure, because this is a safety regulation, it's meant to protect you know, health, safety, and fundamental rights, then we don't have omissions in what we deem to be high risk. So the work that we've done in these two directions, I'll go a little bit technical, but I'll try to step back. There is an article in the regulation that sends basically the reader to the annex. That is, it says, you know, everything in the annex is considered high risk, and then you have to read the annex. So we have worked both in the annex and on that particular article. On the article, we worked on the side of not over-regulating, and we tried to narrow down the scope of the high risk by excluding those systems that are clearly not posing a threat to health, safety, or fundamental rights, but that would be inadvertently be caught by the rather imperfect way of capturing classes of systems in a list in the annex. So what we've done on the particular article, we've excluded some certain potential AI systems that are very simple and have no impact. So for example, if they do a narrow procedural task or have no impact on the decision made or on the output of the system. So those smaller AI systems that might be integrated into a bigger AI system that finds itself in the annex. So through that, we try to relieve some of the burden. At the same time, because this is a balancing equilibrium, we have added, also knowing that we have this filter now, we have added in the annex a number of use cases that we felt are important not to be left out, dealing, for example, with education, some use cases in education, in employment, in the provision of essential services, and something that was also important for our cabinet and for Dragos and myself, AI systems used to influence votes in elections or referenda, because we feel that that's one of the risks that we need to be very careful to mitigate, because of course democracy is the underlying system that in which we can then operate and work with the regulation and with, you know, supporting AI innovation and so on. So long story short, we have narrowed down what it means to be high risk by excluding those obviously not high risk. And we have added a number of cases in the annex. And of course, in more detail, we have refined the language in some of the initial proposals of what was in the annex, and so on. So that's the work that we've done on high risk.
And the providers of high-risk AI systems, as far as I understand, will be kind of the busiest ones, trying to meet the obligations in the regulation, because most of the obligations apply to them, right? Could you give us, let's say, an overview of what are the most important of these obligations? You mentioned conformity assessments, for instance. What is, let's say, the core of their set of obligations?
Well, you really have to be very technical and to read through the regulation, but there is a set that applies to all of these high-risk case systems. So we need to have a risk management system in place, data governance, or rules for data governance, for the data that goes into the training of AI systems, cybersecurity measures, human oversight, documentation obligations. So all of these together, right, really technically, Articles 8 to 15 are, taken together, are the conformity assessment, right? So once a provider does that conformity assessment, then it's assumed to be in compliance, and then can affix the CE marking on the product that is the high-risk AI system. Now, it is true that providers will have to do most of the work. Nevertheless, Parliament, the European Parliament, has worked on the following assumption, and this probably might be familiar to your audience from the data protection impact assessment, that the use, the context of use of an AI system matters, especially for fundamental rights. So it really does matter if you use something to grade exams, or to allocate people to, or to hire and fire people in a homogeneous community, for example, or in marginalized community, where these decisions have a different impact, or if your group contains, I don't know, minorities, or it contains people with disabilities and so on. So Parliament has introduced a requirement for a fundamental rights impact assessment that takes place at the deployer side, not at the provider side. Now, this, in order to, of course, not increase the bureaucracy, takes into account the documentation that providers have on their AI systems, and then it can be combined with the data protection impact assessment if such a data protection impact assessment needs to be done by the deployer in any case. But if, for example, they don't, I'm having a hard time giving an example where they wouldn't do a data protection, but they would do fundamental rights impact assessment. But probably there are instances like that. So there is this obligation for deployers of these systems as well.
So my understanding is, not in any case, not all of the deployers will need to conduct a fundamental rights impact assessment, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
There's also a level of risk that's taken into account there.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it is basically the deployers who are public authorities, first and foremost, and then those providing essential services, or that have, they can have legal effects. But, I think in the big landscape of what is high-risk AI systems, most of them will be in this particular category, because using an AI system for something that's, doesn't lead to any decision, and it's not, most likely it's not going to be used in a high-risk use case in the annex, and therefore not covered by the regulation anyway.
Other than the fundamental rights impact assessment, are there instances where the AI Act shifts a bit to at least a semblance of regulating in the space of protecting fundamental rights, right? As opposed to a safety regulation, like a regulation that's shifts towards fundamental rights type of interventions from the legislative. I remember at one point during the legislative process, the parliament had proposed a set of principles that would be applicable to all AI systems, if I remember correctly. What happened to those in the process? Do we still see some of them as the text is finalized?
So I think this has two components, and the first one is that indeed, it's a simplified way to present the AI Act as just safety regulation, because the scope of the AI Act is health, safety, and fundamental rights throughout. So basically, and the more we worked on it, the more it was about fundamental rights, because health and safety is usually with products, that have like a physical component that can threaten your health and safety in a rather direct kinetic way, so to speak, or mental health in some instances. But and those are already probably regulated by other instruments, and therefore we had to work more into clarifying the overlap between sectoral legislation governing those products and the AI Act. So most of the work in the AI Act is actually focused on fundamental rights and protecting fundamental rights. So in terms of the scope. Now, more specifically to the principles. I have to say that I did not personally, so it's personal because we had them in the parliament position and we supported them in negotiations. I didn't feel that they're that useful to have in a legal text, because this is a risk-based regulation. That is, if it can pose, threats to health, safety, fundamental rights, then it needs to do this conformity assessment to be compliant. Nevertheless, by introducing, even at the level of principle, in a legal text, a number of obligations that are based on fundamental rights made little sense to me for AI systems that have nothing to do with fundamental rights. So if you build an AI system based on data on your tomatoes, right, and you're growing tomatoes and you have very good data and you have all these sensors there, you really cannot make that system fair and unbiased towards humans in a sense, right? But you will still need to hire a lawyer to make sure that you're compliant somehow with that article on principles. So I think that the final outcome was that we have these in a recital as guidance for, okay, here's how you should be developing AI systems. And I think they are accompanied by the codes of conduct, which are for AI systems that are not deemed high risk, but could eventually be, risky in a sense. And there is a whole section on codes of conduct that also hints at some of these principles. So with the work in the recitals that is in the preamble of the law, and with this possibility to develop codes of conduct when building AI systems that are not high risk, I feel that we've done a good job in covering that other space, which is not directly regulated by high risk. And I would point to another section, which is fairly significant. I know we had focused on the high risk, which is the work that was driven by Parliament on setting rules for artificial intelligence, general purpose artificial intelligence models. That is, for those models that could be used in a variety of ways, including for high risk use cases, once they are built into an AI system. And we've done a lot of work on that, and there's a lot of safeguards, and a lot of these principles have informed the work that we've done on the models.
Absolutely, and I was hoping to get a bit into the general purpose AI systems, because I know that was one of the most debated points towards the end of the legislative process. But before going there, I want to pick up a question that we received from Yasmin, and that also goes into one of the things we wanted to discuss in any case. She's asking what are the main ways through which UK companies will be impacted by the EU AI Act? And then let's extrapolate a bit. What, just a short question. What is the global impact of the AI Act?
I think the question is short. The answer, I'm going to try to be disciplined and keep it short. I think that the European Union is a very powerful regulator worldwide because just by economics, we have a very large market, and then going to the European market, one needs to follow European regulation. So, of course, every company that thinks of selling on the European market has to take that into account. Now, in terms of the direct impact, there are provisions that would, this is a regulation that applies when you place something or make available on the European market. So, at any given point, the provider on the outside wanting to sell an AI system in the European Union or a model, or to put on the market a model in the European Union, once that happens, the placing on the market, putting into service, it needs to be compliant, and therefore the compliance needs to happen earlier before going to the European market. That's a very long way of saying that it will have an impact on everybody who plans to sell in the EU. They will need to be compliant with the regulation. And there are, of course, different ways in which this acts, right? So one is for the high-risk AI systems. Another one is for the prohibitions. Of course, you cannot put them on the market, so that closes the European market for any of the prohibited use cases, and that's a nuance to be discussed. And then, of course, for the providers of models, and especially the very big and powerful models, they need to start working on complying with the rules and the regulation, because the expectation for them, I'm assuming, an informed assumption, is that they will want those models to be used downstream in the union by many companies, startups, SMEs, and so on. So they're really looking at a very big market for their models. So they need to start working on compliance as well.
Before going there, let's just stay a bit in the global impact space. And I'm wondering to what extent during the whole process, the team working on it paid attention to things that were happening outside of the EU, or maybe at international organizations level, at the OECD, in other jurisdictions that are very active in this space. So, of course, we have the United States and the Biden executive order, but then we also have jurisdictions like Singapore, which had been very active proposing things like AI Verify and AI governance frameworks in the self-regulatory space. To what extent there was an intent to be attuned to some of these other things and try to come with solutions that would work perhaps also outside of the EU?
I think that not just for our office, I think that we were the most passionate about it, but for the entire negotiating team, this was one of the top priorities. And it wasn't just a priority in terms of, oh yeah, paying lip service to the priority. We actually worked on the text with that in mind and engaging internationally. So you mentioned the OECD. We have worked at the technical level and very directly and very closely with the OECD team, working on their own version of a definition of AI, which is one of the very big political and, not just political, but also technical points in the regulation. And Now we have in the parliament and in the OECD and in the final outcome of the negotiations, we have a definition that is very, very similar, almost to the comma, between the European Union and the OECD. And that, of course, allows us to have a common language, a common taxonomy of what we mean by an AI system. We have engaged with the United States a lot, and with the work that they've done on the executive order. And some of the logic that we have in the EU AI Act, especially for governing powerful models, is very much aligned. I wouldn't want to attribute, the origin or the causality, but these two processes have influenced one another throughout. So we were in constant contact with them on, what are the set of rules that we can all agree on now. And of course, two different regulatory traditions, right? We have hard law. In the US, it was an executive order, but they have different leverage mechanisms, right? So the US does have the federal agencies to enforce a little bit the executive order, and they have public procurement that they use a little bit more dexterous than us in enforcing that. We have more hard law, but if you look and you read them side by side, they are guided by the same ideas, and that is the result of a continuous and very, very intense engagement process with them. The UK, we have engaged, and we feel that there is a space where the UK has taken a little bit the lead, not the lead, but they took the idea and ran with it, basically on the existential risk front, and mitigating those risks that are not present now necessarily, which are discrimination and bias and so on, and data protection and all of these, but looking into the future. And they've done a good job, and I feel that also influenced the way we have thought about the systemic models and how to govern them. You see, there's an AI office in the European Union. There's an AI safety office in the UK. And again, I don't want to attribute causality, but there was an engagement process there as well. And G7, of course, and Council of Europe is working. We have engaged a little less from the negotiating team, but as the European Union, we have engaged with those negotiations as well. So, if not the main one, and incidentally, we also have engaged with Singapore, our office, and with AI Verify and what they're doing there, and they're doing a great job as well. Of course, we had the legislative priority, but the underlying, theme or priority, secondary priority informing the first one was to seek as much as possible this international convergence, especially with our like-minded partners. So with the US, with the UK, and other similar initiatives.
That's quite reassuring that this was part of the process, this type of thinking. Let's, in the few minutes that we have left, I would want to look a bit into the general purpose AI models and what was the thinking behind designing special rules for them. And what are those rules? As far as I understand, there's a risk level that's also applied to the general purpose AI models, but it's a parallel risk framework than the one with the prohibitions and the high risk AI systems and so forth. Whatever background you can give us on this, it would be very helpful.
Definitely. So this was also, if you look at the different variants of the text, this was also a Parliament contribution to the whole negotiation process. And I want to say that it wasn't necessarily informed by the rise of OpenAI and ChatGPT and all of the public attention that it got, because in Parliament we had been thinking about this framework for models at the time, foundation models, even before this became a very sexy topic to discuss for everybody. And the reason for that is that, you know, the more powerful these models are, the more it becomes difficult to eliminate or to check for some of the biases and some of the threats to fundamental rights at the system level when they have an interface and where you can interact with the system and the system produces an output, or at the deployer level. So there are some more systemic risks that can be mitigated there. And of course, in keeping with the risk-based approach of the regulation, we try not to over-regulate, but we did see fit to have that in. Of course, when this became very, a very popular topic in the public conversation, it helped our cause a lot. Otherwise, it would have been an uphill battle with the other institutions to get something that moved away from the initial proposal. So it did help, but I do want to say that it was there long before that thinking. Now, in terms of the obligations, we have two categories of general purpose AI models. So first of all, these are models that are built at scale, you know, that take a lot of data and that they can be deployed for a number of different and individual tasks. Those who are not reaching a certain threshold have minimal transparency and documentation obligations. So be transparent about what you do, show, you know, some details about your model, and document that so that, you know, if something goes wrong, we can go back and trace it. No other obligations. For those models deemed to have a systemic impact, so the very big and powerful, who can impact societies in different ways, or economies, or so on, there are additional rules which are still commonsensical and that try to achieve that balance, to have a risk management system in place, to have an incident reporting system in place that connects to the UK right safety, because there are some risks that are unknown. So just reporting them helps to mitigate a little bit of those risks. Testing the models and an obligation to work with the enforcer, in this case the AI office, to, you know, keep up to date with the evolutions and to work to make sure that this enforcement of the rules is more fluid. The trade-off that we saw fit was that we don't understand the technology that well to set more rules in place now. So we have allowed some flexibility in the enforcement in exchange for having less hard rules in the regulation now. And that allows also industry to work to co-create the rules in the future.
Thank you so much for that overview. We didn't have the time to go into the AI office a bit and the whole governance model. Let's say before we wrap up, just one more thing to address, and very quickly. There have been reports this past days that some opposition to the AI Act is being built by a couple of the member states, of the EU member states. In your personal estimation, will we have a final text adopted? Will the text go through the legislative process, or do you see there's some wind behind the opposition that the media writes about?
Well, look, I'll be very brief, as you asked. You know, I think the text will go through, and I think it's going to be okay. There's interest in the press, of course, and everything that smells of something that could make a
Blood.
little bit of agitation exactly is absolutely a headline. And there are elections coming up in Europe, so you have a small number of very vocal members of parliament, small meaning one or two, who are using this literally just in elections. But that's not, I wouldn't take it too seriously. And not because, it's just politics, but because the text is good, because it has a solid majority, because everybody's been working on it. So, I wouldn't worry about that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for making the time to talk to us and to our community on LinkedIn. Now, everyone, we have a text. We cannot use the excuse that there's no text. So we need to get into the weeds of it. And I'm sure we'll have plenty of topics of debate and discussion in the following years. As everyone will be preparing to for the application of the act once it's adopted, and then it will become applicable in a staggered way throughout the following years. Thank you very much, and everybody have a very good Friday and a very nice weekend ahead.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you, everybody.